David Reed sat in the back row of the tactical analysis classroom, watching holographic battle simulations flicker across the curved walls. 300 students from 40 different species filled the tiered seats, and he was one of only 3 humans in the entire Advanced Tactical Institute. The instructor, a krill named Professor Harnack, moved through the simulation with practiced ease, pausing the display to highlight a critical moment. "Notice here," Harnack said, his voice carrying through the chamber, "how the defending force positioned their units. Classic Corvasi doctrine. Strong frontal assault, overwhelming force, minimal subtlety." He glanced around the room. Can anyone identify the weakness in this approach? Several hands shot up, mostly from students whose species had military traditions spanning millennia. David kept his hand down, observing. He had learned in his 3 years here that speaking up too often drew the wrong kind of attention. "The human," Harnack said, pointing directly at David. "Your people fought wars for thousands of years before joining the coalition. What do you see?" David stood aware of dozens of eyes turning toward him. The defending commander committed all reserves to the front line. No fallback positions. If the line breaks, there's nothing to stop a complete collapse. And why would a Corvasi commander make such a choice? Because their natural armor makes them difficult to kill. They're used to holding positions through sheer durability rather than tactical depth. Harnack's expression was unreadable behind his faceplates. Interesting observation. The Corvasi might call that cultural bias, but you're not wrong. He turned back to the simulation. Humans compensate for physical limitations with tactical flexibility. Some call it paranoia. Others call it adaptation. A few students chuckled. David sat down, feeling the familiar weight of representing his entire species in every answer, every observation, every moment. The class ended an hour later. David gathered his materials and headed for the exit, planning to meet Rachel and Omar at the commissary. He made it halfway down the corridor before a voice stopped him. "Reed, human." David turned. Bryn stood there, flanked by 2 others. The Corvasi was massive, easily 7 feet tall, his armored hide gleaming under the corridor lights. His companions were equally impressive. Stellan, a Hyperion with eyes that seemed to look through solid objects, and Mira, a Ventari whose green-tinged skin could process toxins that would kill most species instantly. "Yes?" David kept his tone neutral. "That was an interesting comment in class," Bryn said, moving closer. "About Corvasi tactics. About our armor. I was answering a question. You suggested we lack sophistication, that we rely on durability instead of intelligence." David felt other students slowing down in the corridor, sensing confrontation. "I said the commander in that simulation committed his reserves too early. That's tactical analysis, not cultural criticism." Bryn smiled, showing teeth designed for tearing. "Your species has been in the coalition for what, 30 years? And you think you understand warfare better than cultures that have fought for 10,000? I think every species has something to learn from every other species." Diplomatic answer. Stellan spoke for the first time, his voice carrying an odd resonance. "But you didn't mean it diplomatically in class, did you?" David looked at the 3 of them. Students had stopped now, forming a loose circle. This was going somewhere, and he had no good options for stopping it. "Look," David said carefully, "I'm not interested in whatever this is. I answered a professor's question in class. That's all." "But it's never just that, is it?" Mira said. "You humans come to our institutions, join our military, act like partners. But you're so fragile. No armor, no enhanced reflexes, no regeneration. You survive through luck and numbers." David felt heat rising in his chest but forced it down. "Is there a point to this?" Bryn stepped closer. "The point is that we're tired of pretending humans belong at an elite military academy. You don't have the physical capability. You don't have the cultural foundation. You're here because the coalition wants to appear inclusive. Then take it up with the admissions board. Or," Bryn said, "we could settle this another way. Prove that humans deserve to be here." David's instinct screamed warning. "I'm not fighting you. That's exactly what you want. Not a fight." Bryn smiled wider. "A test. My people have an ancient tradition called the cylinder, a measure of courage that has been used for thousands of years. Very simple, very direct. We use it here at the academy, among those who wish to prove themselves." David knew about the proving grounds. Every student did. The ancient chamber where challenges were issued and resolved. It was all technically legal, sanctioned by academy tradition, supervised by faculty. But it was also dangerous. What kind of test? David asked, though part of him already knew he shouldn't engage. Stellan produced a small case from his jacket. He opened it, revealing a weapon, old-fashioned by galactic standards, but David recognized it immediately. A revolver. 6 chambers, manual operation. The cylinder, Bryn explained. 6 chambers, 1 loaded. Participants take turns. The cylinder spins between each turn. Game continues until the round fires or someone withdraws. Those who withdraw first carry the shame of cowardice. David stared at the weapon. You want to play Russian roulette? Your people's name for it, yes. Though we've played this game long before we met humans. Interesting that you invented it too. Bryn's smile turned cruel. Unless your people only invented it because you're naturally suicidal. Fragile species often are. The crowd had grown larger. David could see students recording on their devices. Whatever happened next would spread through the entire academy within hours. Would probably reach Earth within days. Why would I agree to this? David asked. Because if you don't, everyone here will know that humans are cowards. That all your tactical cleverness is just compensation for physical weakness and moral cowardice. That you don't belong at a warrior's academy. David looked around the corridor. Dozens of faces watched. Some eager for violence. Some uncomfortable but watching anyway. Some simply curious about what the human would do. He thought about Rachel and Omar. About the other human students who would arrive in coming years. About every conversation where someone dismissed human military achievements as luck or desperation. About 3 years of subtle dismissals and casual prejudice. If I do this, David said slowly, and I don't withdraw, you acknowledge that humans earned their place here. You stop questioning whether we belong, Bryn laughed. If you do this without withdrawing, I'll personally recommend humans for the advanced tactical program. But you won't make it that far. You'll withdraw. Your species doesn't have the genetic fortitude for true tests of courage. David felt the weight of the moment. The smart choice was to walk away. Report this to Academy officials. Let the system handle it. But the system had been handling human integration for 3 years, and students like Bryn still saw humans as inferior. When? David asked. Bryn's smile grew. Tomorrow evening. The proving grounds. Traditional time. Witnesses will be present. Faculty supervision. As required by Academy protocols. Everything legal. Everything proper. And the other participants? Myself, Stellan, and Mira. 4 participants. Better odds than the traditional 6-person game. We're being generous. David almost laughed. 4 participants meant 4 turns before the first round of the game completed. 25% chance on that first round. The odds got worse from there. I accept, David heard himself say. The corridor erupted in noise. Students talking, devices chiming as messages spread. Bryn extended his hand. David shook it, feeling the crushing strength the Korvasi could have applied but didn't. Not yet. Tomorrow then, Bryn said. Try not to think about it too much. Though I suppose for humans that's all you can do. Think and worry. You can't rely on your bodies, so you live in your heads. The 3 of them walked away, leaving David standing in the corridor. The crowd dispersed slowly. Students talking excitedly about tomorrow's event. David stood still, processing what he had just agreed to. His comm device buzzed. Rachel's voice came through, urgent. David, what the hell did you just do? It's all over the Academy network. Tell me you didn't actually agree to the cylinder. David started walking toward the commissary. I'll explain when I see you. Explain? David, that game is survivable for species with danger sense or armor or regeneration. You're human. You have none of those things. This is suicide. It's not suicide, David said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. It's calculated risk. Calculated? 1 in 4 chance of dying on the first round, and that's if everyone stays in. This is insane. David reached the commissary entrance. Through the glass, he could see Omar already at a table, his face tight with worry. Rachel would be there in minutes. He would have to explain to them both why he had agreed to something so dangerous. But as he pushed through the door, David realized he wasn't entirely sure himself. Pride, representation, stubbornness, maybe all 3. Or maybe he was tired of being seen as lesser because his body lacked natural weapons and armor. Tomorrow evening he would face a test that could kill him, and the only advantage he had was the same thing humans had always relied on when facing superior opponents. The willingness to face death anyway. Rachel slammed her datapad on the table hard enough to make nearby students look over. 23 minutes. That's how long it took for this to reach Earth. Military command is already sending inquiries. Your parents are trying to contact you. And the Academy administration is pretending they can't interfere with traditional challenges. David sat across from her and Omar in a quiet corner of the library. Around them, thousands of data crystals glowed softly on shelves that stretched toward the curved ceiling. He had come here to research the cylinder, but Rachel and Omar had found him first. "Show me what you found," David said. Rachel turned her pad around. Text scrolled across the screen. Ancient records translated into standard coalition language. The cylinder originated on the Corvasi homeworld about 6,000 years ago. Started as a ritual duel between warriors, eventually evolved into this game as a way to test courage without guaranteed death. Without guaranteed death, Omar repeated. He was studying medicine at the academy, and his expression showed exactly what he thought of the game's safety record. For Corvasi, maybe. Their skulls have reinforced bone structure. Even a direct hit has a 70% survival rate with immediate medical intervention. What about the other species that play? David asked. That's the thing. Rachel pulled up more data. Every recorded instance of the cylinder being played at this academy involved species with significant defensive advantages. The Corvasi have armor. The Hyperions have danger sense that tells them which chamber is loaded. The Ventari can survive massive trauma through regeneration. Even the Krill have redundant neural pathways. Omar leaned forward. Humans have none of that. Our skulls are thin. Our healing is slow. We don't sense danger. David, this game was designed by and for species that can survive it. Then why do they play at all? David asked. If they know they'll survive, where's the courage? Rachel and Omar exchanged glances. That's actually a good point, Rachel admitted. But it doesn't change the reality. You pull that trigger, and if the chamber is loaded, you die. No second chances. No regeneration. No armor to deflect the round. David had spent the previous night thinking about exactly that. The mathematical certainty of his own fragility. But he had also thought about something else. Tell me about the Hyperion danger sense. How does it work? Omar pulled up biological data on his own pad. Hyperions evolved on a world with extreme predators. They developed a kind of precognitive awareness of immediate threats. It's not perfect, but in a situation like the cylinder, Stellan will know if the loaded chamber is about to fire. His heart rate will spike, his pupils will dilate. His body will prepare for the threat before his conscious mind even processes it. So he's not really facing random chance, David said. None of them are, Rachel said quietly. That's what makes this so unfair. Bryn's armor means even if he loses, he probably survives. Stellan's danger sense means he knows when to withdraw. Mira's regeneration means she can recover from almost anything. They created this challenge knowing you're the only one who can't cheat. David stood and walked to the window. Outside, stars wheeled past as the Academy station rotated. Somewhere out there was Earth, a blue marble that had produced a species with no natural weapons, no armor, no special abilities, just intelligence and stubbornness. I found something else, Omar said hesitantly. Records of human psychological response to mortal threat. Compared to most species, humans experience fear more intensely. Our stress hormones are more potent. Our fight or flight response is more pronounced. We're literally wired to be more afraid than species like the Corvasi. Your point? David asked without turning around. My point is that doing this isn't just dangerous. It's going to be psychologically harder for you than it is for them. They'll be nervous. You'll be terrified. That's just biology. David thought about that. Humans evolved on a world where nearly everything could kill them. Large predators, diseases, rival tribes, environmental hazards. Fear had kept humans alive long enough to develop intelligence. Fear was a gift even if it didn't feel like one. How many participants have withdrawn from the cylinder? David asked. Rachel checked her data. In the last century at this academy, 47 games played. 31 participants withdrew before the loaded chamber fired. 16 games played to completion. And how many deaths? None. Because in every case, at least one participant had the ability to sense which turn would be fatal. The games end when someone with danger sense withdraws, or when the participant with the best defensive abilities agrees to take the final turn. David turned back to face them. So it's all theater. A ritual that looks dangerous but is actually carefully managed by biological advantages. Yes, Rachel said, which is why you shouldn't play. You can't manage the risk like they can. For you, every turn is genuinely random. Every pull of the trigger is real chance of death. Maybe that's the point, David said. Omar shook his head. The point is to get you killed or to make you withdraw and humiliate all humans. Either way, Bryn wins. David sat back down. Did you find anything about why humans invented Russian roulette? You mean besides being insane? Rachel muttered, but she searched her pad anyway. References go back to Earth's 19th and 20th centuries. Seems to have originated in Russia, hence the name. Used as a form of gambling, intimidation, or demonstration of courage. Or desperation, Omar added. A lot of historical references link it to extreme circumstances. Prison camps, war zones, places where life was already cheap. Places where humans had no advantages, David said. No armor, no weapons, no backup. Just themselves and a choice. Rachel studied him. You're not going to back out, are you? If I back out, every human who comes to this academy will be seen as weak. Bryn made this public. The whole station knows. If I withdraw, it confirms everything they believe about us. And if you die, that confirms it too, Rachel said sharply. Dead people don't prove points, David. But people who face death do. David met her eyes. Look, I'm not trying to be a martyr. I'm trying to understand the game. If I can't sense danger and I can't survive a hit and I can't regenerate, then what advantage do I have? None, Omar said flatly. That's what we've been trying to tell you. No. David stood again, pacing. There has to be something. Humans didn't survive on Earth by being the strongest or fastest or most durable. We survived because we thought differently. We used tools, tactics, cooperation. We turned disadvantages into advantages. This isn't a team event, Rachel said. You can't cooperate your way out of a loaded chamber. But I can think about it differently than they do. David stopped pacing. They see the cylinder as a test they can manage through their abilities. I see it as pure chance, random probability. And humans have dealt with random probability for our entire existence, Omar frowned. I'm not following. Every human who ever went to war knew they might die. Every human who explored unknown territory or crossed an ocean, or left Earth for the stars. We've never had the luxury of knowing we'd survive. We just decided some things were worth doing anyway. That's very philosophical, Rachel said. But tomorrow evening you're going to be holding a gun to your head. Philosophy won't stop a bullet. No, David agreed. But maybe understanding why I'm doing it will help me stay calm. The game isn't really about the gun. It's about who withdraws first. Who breaks under pressure. And pressure is just fear of the future. Omar stood up and walked over to David. I'm going to say this as your friend and as someone who's studied human physiology extensively. You are going to be afraid tomorrow. More afraid than Bryn or Stellan or Mira. That's not weakness. That's biology. But you need to understand it's going to be harder for you than it is for them in ways that have nothing to do with courage. I know, David said quietly. I've been thinking about that all night. About how it will feel. About the weight of the gun. About the sound the cylinder makes when it spins. About the pressure of metal against my temple. Rachel looked away. David, please. I have to think about it, David said. Because tomorrow I can't hesitate. If I hesitate, if I show fear, then I've already lost. The game is as much psychological as physical. The game is about survival, Omar said, and you're entering it with the worst possible odds. David smiled slightly. Story of humanity, isn't it? We've always had the worst odds. We're still here. They sat in silence for a moment. Other students moved through the library, studying for exams or working on projects. Normal academy life continuing around them while David prepared to risk everything. I'm going to the proving grounds, David said finally. I want to see the chamber. Understand the space. I'll come with you, Rachel said immediately. Me too, Omar added. They left the library together and made their way through the academy's corridors. Word had spread about tomorrow's challenge. Students they passed either stared openly or whispered to each other. A few nodded respectfully. Most looked at David like he was already dead. The proving grounds occupied an old section of the station, part of the original structure built centuries ago. The entrance was marked by an arch covered in inscriptions from dozens of languages and species. Rachel translated some of them as they walked through. Courage tested here, honor preserved, warriors proved. She paused at one that seemed older than the others. This one just says, remember mortality. The chamber itself was circular, about 30 meters across. The walls were covered with names carved or etched or burned into every available surface, centuries of students who had participated in challenges here. David walked slowly around the room, reading names. Some he recognized from academy history, others were completely unknown. In the center of the room was a simple pedestal. Tomorrow, the weapon would rest there. Tomorrow, 4 individuals would stand here and take turns testing their courage against random chance. It's smaller than I thought it would be, Omar said. More intimate. That's intentional, Rachel said. Challenges here are supposed to be personal, not performances for crowds, though I'm sure tomorrow will be different. David stood in the center of the room, trying to imagine how it would feel. The weight of watching eyes, the knowledge that every moment was being recorded, the cold metal of the revolver, the mechanical click of the cylinder spinning. His hands were steady. That was something. David, Rachel said from behind him, you can still walk away. There's no shame in refusing an unfair challenge. David turned to face his friends. Rachel, brilliant and stubborn, who had fought her own battles to prove human engineering was valuable. Omar, thoughtful and precise, who studied medicine because he wanted to understand how to keep fragile humans alive in space. They believed in him, but they also feared for him. If I walk away, David said, Bryn wins without firing a shot. Every human becomes the species that talks tough but runs when challenged. I can't let that be our legacy. And if you die? Omar asked. What legacy is that? Then at least they'll know we don't die easily, that we face our end with eyes open. David smiled slightly. Besides, I'm not planning to die. I'm planning to show them what human courage looks like when you don't have armor or danger sense or regeneration, just will and stubbornness. Rachel hugged him suddenly, fiercely. You're an idiot, but you're our idiot. Omar joined the embrace. For what it's worth, I'll be there tomorrow. Both of us will. Whatever happens. They left the proving grounds together. David felt the weight of tomorrow settling on his shoulders, but he also felt something else. Clarity, understanding. The game wasn't about survival. It was about demonstrating that humans belonged here, that they could stand equal to species with every advantage. Tomorrow evening, he would load a revolver, spin the cylinder, and smile. Not because he wasn't afraid, but because fear hadn't stopped humans yet and it wouldn't stop them now. The game was about showing courage without advantage, and if there was one thing humans understood, it was facing impossible odds anyway. 200 students packed into the proving grounds chamber, lining the walls in tense silence. David had expected a crowd, but seeing it was different. Every face turned toward the center of the room, toward the pedestal where an ancient revolver rested under harsh lighting. The weapon looked almost ceremonial, its metal polished to a mirror shine, but David knew it was functional, deadly. Professor Harnack stood near the entrance in his official capacity as witness. Several other instructors had come as well, their expressions ranging from disapproval to grim curiosity. The academy headmaster had sent a message earlier that day. The challenge was within traditional protocols. He could not interfere, but he strongly advised David to reconsider. David had not reconsidered. He stood to one side of the chamber, Rachel and Omar flanking him. Across the room, Bryn held court with a group of upperclassmen laughing at something one of them said. Stellan stood apart, his strange eyes distant, already sensing patterns in probability that David could never perceive. Mira leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching David with an expression he couldn't quite read. Last chance, Rachel whispered. We can still walk out of here. David shook his head. The time for walking away had passed the moment he accepted the challenge. Everything that happened now was about follow-through, about showing that humans didn't make promises they couldn't keep. A chime sounded, cutting through the murmur of conversation. Professor Harnack stepped forward, his voice amplified by the chamber's acoustics. We gather to witness a challenge issued and accepted according to ancient tradition. 4 participants will test their courage through the cylinder. The rules are simple and known to all. 6 chambers, 1 loaded. Each participant takes a turn. The cylinder spins between turns. The game continues until the loaded chamber fires or all participants withdraw. Those who withdraw first accept the judgment of cowardice. The professor's eyes found David. This is the final opportunity for any participant to withdraw without shame. The challenge has been witnessed. Honor has been satisfied. Is there any who wishes to step back? Silence filled the chamber. David met Bryn's eyes across the room. The Corvasi smiled, confident and cruel. He expected David to withdraw now in front of everyone, proving his point about human weakness. No withdrawals, David said clearly. Harnack nodded slowly. Then let the participants approach. David walked to the center of the chamber. His legs felt steady. His hands didn't shake. He had spent the entire day preparing mentally for this moment, visualizing each step, each action. The human mind's ability to rehearse and prepare was one advantage he did have. Bryn arrived at the pedestal first, moving with the casual confidence of someone who had never truly feared for his life. Stellan came next, his movements more careful, more considered. Mira took her place with professional efficiency. David completed the circle. Up close, the revolver looked even older. The metal bore microscopic scratches from centuries of use. How many students had held this weapon? How many had faced this same test? The order will be determined by traditional method, Harnack announced. He produced 4 small stones, each a different color. Draw your stone. Bryn drew first. Red. He would go first. Stellan drew blue. Second position. Mira drew green. Third. David reached into the bag and pulled out the remaining stone. Yellow. He would go last in each round. Going last meant watching 3 others take their turns first. Meant seeing the cylinder spin 3 times before his own chance came. David wasn't sure if that was better or worse than going first. More time to think. More time for fear to build. The weapon will now be loaded, Harnack said. He picked up the revolver with practiced care, broke it open to show 6 empty chambers. From a sealed container, he removed a single round. He held it up for everyone to see, then loaded it into one chamber. The cylinder snapped shut. 1 round confirmed, another instructor called out from the witnessing position. Harnack spun the cylinder, the clicking sound echoing through the silent chamber. He spun it 3 times, ensuring randomization. Then he placed the weapon back on the pedestal. Bryn of Corvasi, you have drawn first position. Step forward. Bryn moved to the pedestal. He picked up the revolver, testing its weight. For all his confidence, David noticed a slight tension in the Corvasi's shoulders. This was real now. The game had begun. The cylinder will be spun before each turn, Harnack said. 6 chambers. 1 loaded. Statistical probability on the first round is 1 in 6 per participant. Bryn spun the cylinder himself, the mechanical sound somehow louder than before. He raised the weapon to his temple. The room held its breath. For a long moment, Bryn stood frozen. David realized the Corvasi had never actually done this before, had watched others, perhaps participated in practice rounds with empty weapons, but never held a loaded gun to his own head. Then Bryn's finger tightened on the trigger. Click. Empty chamber. The sound of the hammer falling on nothing was somehow more frightening than a shot would have been. It meant the loaded chamber was still waiting. Bryn lowered the weapon, his expression carefully neutral, but David saw the slight tremor in his hands as he placed the revolver back on the pedestal. The Corvasi stepped back to his position. Stellan of Hyperia, you have drawn second position. Step forward. Stellan approached the pedestal more slowly than Bryn had. His danger sense would be active now, reading probability and threat. David watched the Hyperian's face carefully. Would he show signs of knowing whether this turn was safe or deadly? Stellan spun the cylinder, picked up the weapon, raised it to his temple. He hesitated longer than Bryn had. His pupils dilated slightly. Was that the danger sense activating, or just normal fear? David couldn't tell. Click. Another empty chamber. Stellan's breath came out in a rush. He had definitely been uncertain. The danger sense wasn't perfect, wasn't giving him clear answers, or perhaps the threat wasn't immediate enough to trigger his instincts fully. Mira of Ventari, you have drawn third position. Step forward. Mira moved with professional calm. She had military training, David knew, had probably faced actual combat. But combat was different from this. In combat, you had options, tactics, movement. Here there was only chance and will. She spun the cylinder efficiently. Raised the weapon. No hesitation. Click. Empty. 3 down. 1 to go in the first round. David Reed of Earth, you have drawn fourth position. Step forward. David's heart hammered in his chest as he approached the pedestal. The revolver waited. Cold metal. 6 chambers. 3 had just been tested and proven empty. 3 chambers remained. One of those 3 held the round that could end his life. Mathematically, his odds right now were 1 in 3. Worse than when Bryn had started. Much worse. David picked up the revolver. It was heavier than he expected. The grip felt foreign in his hand, despite humanity's long history with such weapons. He had trained with modern coalition firearms at the academy, but this antique was different. More personal somehow, more real. He spun the cylinder, hearing the mechanical clicking as it rotated. Randomizing. The sound stopped. 6 chambers. 1 loaded, 3 untested. David raised the weapon to his temple. The metal was cold against his skin. He could feel his pulse pounding. Every nerve in his body screamed at him to stop, to lower the weapon, to walk away. This was the fear Omar had warned him about. The biological response that made humans more afraid than species with natural defenses. His body knew he was fragile, knew that metal against skull would not end well, but his mind also knew something else. Every human who had ever faced death had felt this same fear. Soldiers in trenches, explorers in unknown lands, astronauts strapping into rockets. Fear was the price of being human, and humans paid that price every time they did something important. David's finger found the trigger. He thought about Earth, about the blue marble spinning in space, home to a species that survived through nothing but intelligence and will, about Rachel and Omar watching from the crowd, about every human who would come to this academy in years to come. He pulled the trigger. Click. Empty. David lowered the weapon slowly. His hand was steady, but his heart raced. He placed the revolver back on the pedestal and stepped back to his position. The first round was complete. 4 participants, 4 empty chambers, 2 chambers remaining, 1 loaded. The odds had just gotten much worse. Round 1 complete, Harnack announced. All participants remain. Statistical probability for round 2 is 1 in 2 per participant after 2 turns. 1 in 1 if play reaches the final turn. The chamber erupted in whispers. Students had expected someone to withdraw by now. Most games ended in the first or second round, with participants backing out as the odds worsened, but all 4 had stayed. There will be a 60-second interval before round 2 begins, Harnack said. Participants may withdraw during this time without formal dishonor. David looked at the others. Bryn's confidence had cracked slightly. Stellan looked genuinely nervous now. Mira's professional calm had tightened into tension. No one moved to withdraw. The 60 seconds crawled past. David used the time to control his breathing, to center himself. The next round would be worse. 1 in 2 odds after Bryn and Stellan went. Potentially fatal odds if it reached his turn. But he had made a commitment. To himself. To his species. To the idea that humans belonged here. Deserved respect. Earned their place through courage rather than natural advantage. Time has elapsed, Harnack said. Round 2 will now begin. Bryn of Kervasi stepped forward. Bryn approached the pedestal. His earlier swagger was gone. He picked up the weapon with obvious reluctance. 2 chambers left. 1 loaded. After this turn, the odds would be perfectly even for the next participant. Bryn spun the cylinder. The clicking sound seemed louder now. More ominous. He raised the weapon to his temple and David saw something he hadn't expected to see. Fear. Real, genuine fear in the Kervasi's eyes. His armored hide wouldn't save him at this range. His species' vaunted durability meant nothing against a direct hit to the brain. For the first time, Bryn understood what David had understood from the beginning. This game could actually kill him. Bryn's hand shook as his finger found the trigger. The whole chamber watched, silent and tense. Time seemed to stretch. Then Bryn's finger moved. Click. Empty. Bryn lowered the weapon like it had burned him. He placed it on the pedestal and stepped back quickly. His face had gone pale beneath his armored skin. One chamber left. One chamber loaded. Stellan of Hyperia, step forward. Stellan didn't move at first. His danger sense would be screaming now. One chamber left. 50% chance of death. His body knew. His instincts knew. Stellan, Harnack prompted. Step forward or withdraw. Slowly, Stellan walked to the pedestal. He looked at the revolver like it was a living thing, dangerous and unpredictable. His hands trembled as he reached for it. He picked up the weapon, looked at it, at the cylinder that held either life or death. Then he looked at David. Something passed between them in that moment. Understanding, perhaps. Recognition. Stellan's danger sense gave him an advantage, but it also meant he knew with certainty what David had faced on every turn. Pure chance. Random probability. No biological warning system. No way to know. Just choice and courage. Stellan lowered the weapon without raising it to his temple. I withdraw, he said quietly. The chamber exploded in noise. Students shouting, some in disbelief, others in approval. Stellan placed the revolver on the pedestal and stepped back, his head high despite the shame of withdrawal. Stellan of Hyperia has withdrawn, Harnack announced over the noise. The remaining participants may continue or accept a draw with honor satisfied for all. David looked at Bryn. The Corvasi looked at the revolver. One chamber loaded, one chamber empty. If play continued, Mira would go next. Then David, then back to Bryn. But Stellan's withdrawal had changed something, had proven something. The Hyperion, with all his danger sense advantages, had chosen life over pride, had made the wise choice. Now the question was whether the others would do the same, or whether the game would continue until someone pulled the trigger on the loaded chamber. The chamber remained in chaos for several seconds before Harnack raised his hand for silence. Students gradually quieted, though the tension in the air had transformed into something electric and uncertain. Stellan stood to the side now, no longer in the circle of participants, his expression unreadable. Order, Harnack called. The challenge continues with 3 participants. Mira of Ventari, you hold 3rd position. The turn passes to you. Mira stared at the revolver on the pedestal. One chamber empty, one chamber loaded. 50-50 chance. David watched her face and saw calculation there. She was military trained, used to assessing risk and making tactical decisions. But tactics meant nothing against pure probability. I could withdraw, Mira said, not to Harnack but to the room at large. Stellan withdrew. I could do the same. No one would call it cowardice now. But you won't, Bryn said from his position. You're Ventari. Your people don't quit. Mira's eyes flashed. My people don't die for pride either. We fight when fighting matters. This isn't combat. This is a game designed to prove something that doesn't need proving. She turned to look directly at David. You, human, why are you still here? You have the most to lose. No armor, no regeneration. No advantages at all. One pull of that trigger and you're dead, permanently. Why stay? David met her gaze. The whole chamber waited for his answer. He thought about all the reasons he had given himself over the past day. Pride, representation, proving human worth. But standing here now, facing actual death, those reasons felt incomplete. Because someone has to, David said finally. Bryn challenged human courage. If I withdraw, he wins. If I die, he wins differently, but still wins. The only way forward is through. Through to what? Mira demanded. Through to death? That's not courage. That's suicide. Maybe, David admitted. Or maybe it's understanding that some things matter more than individual survival. Humans have always known we're fragile. We've known for our entire history that we can die easily. But we explore anyway. We fight anyway. We build and create and push forward anyway. Not because we're suicidal. Because we decide what's worth the risk. The chamber had gone completely silent. Every word carried, "Is this worth the risk?" Mira asked. Really? A stupid game played by arrogant students? David looked around the chamber. At the hundreds of faces watching. At Rachel and Omar, their expressions tight with fear. At Bryn, whose confidence had crumbled into something closer to shame. At Stellan, who had chosen wisdom over pride. Yes, David said. Because this stopped being about the game the moment Bryn made it about whether humans belong here. whether we're equal to species with natural advantages. If I walk away, the question remains unanswered. If I stay, at least we'll know. Mira studied him for a long moment. Then she turned to Bryn. You started this. You challenged the human. You wanted to prove Corvasi's superiority. Are you prepared to see it through? Bryn said nothing. The Corvasi who had been so confident yesterday now looked uncertain and young. The reality of loaded weapons had stripped away his swagger. I thought not, Mira said quietly. She looked at the revolver again. The human has more courage than all of us. He faces this with no advantages, no safety net, no second chances, and he does it anyway. She picked up the revolver. Mira, don't, Stellan called from the side. You've made your point. We've all made our point. End this. But Mira spun the cylinder. The clicking sound echoed through the chamber. She raised the weapon to her temple, her face calm and resolved. This is for everyone who thinks courage requires advantages, she said. She pulled the trigger. Click, empty. The chamber released a collective breath. Mira lowered the weapon and placed it on the pedestal. She looked at David and nodded once, a gesture of respect, then stepped back to her position. David Reed of Earth stepped forward. David approached the pedestal on legs that felt steadier than they should. One chamber loaded, one chamber empty. This was it, the moment that would define everything. He picked up the revolver and felt its familiar weight. Before he could spin the cylinder, Bryn spoke. Wait, David paused. Bryn stepped forward, his expression tortured. I withdraw, Bryn said. Noise erupted again. Students shouting in disbelief. Bryn, the one who had started this, who had challenged human courage, was withdrawing, admitting defeat, accepting the shame he had wanted to place on David. I withdraw, Bryn repeated louder. This was wrong. I was wrong. I challenged you to prove human weakness, but all I've proven is my own cowardice. You stood here turn after turn with nothing protecting you. No armor, no regeneration, no danger sense, just will. That's real courage. That's what I didn't understand. He looked at David and there was genuine regret in his eyes. I wanted you to quit. To prove that humans don't belong at a warrior academy. But you've proven the opposite. You belong here more than I do. Because you understand what courage actually means. Bryn turned to Harnack. I formally withdraw. Let the record show I withdrew while the human stood firm. Harnack nodded slowly. Bryn of Corvasi has withdrawn. 2 participants remain. David still held the revolver. Mira stood in her position watching him. The weapon felt heavier now. 1 chamber loaded, 1 chamber empty. If he pulled the trigger, he had a 50% chance of dying. Right here. Right now. In front of everyone. But Bryn had withdrawn. The challenge was effectively over. David had proven his point. Proven that humans didn't quit. Proven that courage without advantage was still courage. Maybe better courage. He could stop now. Could accept the victory. No one would call it cowardice. Except David knew something else. Something he had learned about humans in his years studying Earth's history. Humans didn't just face death when necessary. They faced it on their own terms. They chose how their stories ended. David spun the cylinder. What are you doing? Rachel's voice came from the crowd, anguished. David raised the weapon to his temple. He looked at Bryn, at Stellan, at all the students who had doubted human courage. He thought about every human who had ever faced impossible odds. Every soldier who charged into battle knowing they might not return. Every explorer who sailed into unknown waters. Every astronaut who rode fire into the void. And he smiled. Not a mocking smile. Not a brave smile. Just a simple acknowledgement of what he was about to do and why he was going to do it. This is what being human means, David said clearly. We invented this game. Russian roulette. We created it because sometimes we need to remind ourselves that we're willing to face death. Not despite our fear, but with full awareness of it. Every human who ever did anything important did it knowing they were fragile. Knowing they could fail. Knowing they could die. We do it anyway. His finger found the trigger. David, don't. Omar's voice this time. But David had already made his choice. He thought about Earth. About the blue marble that had birthed a species too stubborn to know when they were outmatched. About the generations of humans who had faced extinction, faced predators, faced war and disease and disaster, and survived through nothing but will and intelligence. He pulled the trigger. Click. Empty. The chamber erupted in noise, but David barely heard it. He lowered the weapon slowly, his hand perfectly steady. He had faced 50-50 odds. Had pulled the trigger knowing he might die. and had done it with a smile because that's what humans did. They faced their mortality and chose courage anyway. David placed the revolver on the pedestal and turned to Mira. "Your turn." Mira stared at him like he was insane. Perhaps he was. Perhaps every human was at least a little insane. How else could you explain a species that left the safety of caves to explore a hostile world? That crossed oceans without knowing what lay beyond the horizon? That shot themselves into space strapped to controlled explosions? "No," Mira said quietly. "I withdraw. Not because I'm afraid, because I've seen what I needed to see." She stepped back from her position. 3 participants have withdrawn. The human stands alone. Let that be remembered. Harnack moved to the center. The challenge is complete. 3 withdrawals. 1 participant remained throughout. David Reed of Earth is acknowledged to have demonstrated superior courage. The chamber erupted in applause, but it wasn't the mocking kind David had feared. It was genuine respect. Students from dozens of species acknowledging what they had witnessed. A human with no natural advantages had faced death repeatedly and never flinched. Bryn approached David, and the Corvasi actually lowered his head in a gesture of submission. "I owe you an apology. Multiple apologies. For challenging you, for underestimating you, for underestimating all humans." David accepted the gesture. "You gave me the opportunity to prove something important. Not just to you, to everyone here. To Earth, maybe that was worth it." "Still," Bryn said, "I was wrong. About humans, about courage, about what matters." He straightened up. "I meant what I said. I'll recommend humans for the advanced tactical program. I'll use my family's influence to support human integration. Whatever I can do." Stellan approached next. "I withdrew because my danger sense told me the loaded chamber was coming. I knew I would die if I stayed." "You didn't have that knowledge." "You faced genuine uncertainty. That's braver than anything I could have done." Mira simply nodded to David, a warrior's acknowledgement of a fellow warrior. No words needed. Rachel and Omar pushed through the crowd and grabbed David in a fierce embrace. Rachel was crying. Omar's eyes were wet too. "You absolute idiot," Rachel said into his shoulder. "You could have died. You should have stopped after Bryn withdrew." "I know," David said. "But I needed to finish it. Needed to show them all the way through." "The smile," Omar said, pulling back to look at David's face. "Why did you smile?" David thought about that. About the moment he raised the weapon for that final turn. About what had gone through his mind. "Because I understood something. Fear is part of being human, but so is the choice to act despite fear. We've been doing it for thousands of years." The smile was acknowledging that. Accepting it. Maybe even celebrating it. Professor Harnack cleared the chamber, ordering students back to their quarters. The show was over, but as David left the proving grounds with Rachel and Omar flanking him, he knew the impact of what had happened would ripple through the academy for years. A human had faced the cylinder without flinching, had smiled in the face of death, had demonstrated courage that required no advantage, no armor, no special abilities. Just the stubborn human refusal to quit. Behind them, the revolver remained on the pedestal. Tomorrow it would be returned to the archives. But the story of what happened here would be told and retold. How a human named David Reed stood alone when others withdrew. How he smiled while facing death. How he proved that courage without advantage was the truest courage of all. As they walked through the corridors, David felt lighter than he had in days. The weight of representation had shifted into something else. Pride, maybe. Or simply the relief of having survived something that could have killed him. "Earth's gonna go insane when they hear about this," Rachel said. "Let them," David replied. "Maybe it's time everyone understood what humans are really capable of." They reached the common area where other human students had gathered, watching news feeds about the challenge. When David entered, they erupted in cheers. He had done more than represent himself. He had represented all of them, and he had proven that humans belonged here in the stars among species with every advantage. Because humans had the one advantage that mattered most, the willingness to face any challenge, accept any risk, and smile while doing it. That was humanity's greatest strength. And now everyone knew it. David woke to discover he had become famous. His comm device held 247 messages, 17 from his parents, 32 from Earth Military Command, 41 from news agencies requesting interviews, the rest from students, instructors, even complete strangers from across the coalition. He ignored most of them and headed to the commissary for breakfast. Rachel and Omar were already there, looking equally overwhelmed by the attention their association with David had brought. "Earth's news networks are calling you the ambassador of courage," Rachel said, showing him her datapad. "The Coalition Council wants a formal statement. And apparently 3 different species have requested information about human military philosophy." "Great," David muttered, taking a seat. "All I wanted was to prove we belong here. I'll become a galactic celebrity." "Too late for that," Omar said. "You pulled a trigger at 50-50 odds while smiling. That's going to be remembered." Other students in the commissary kept glancing over at their table. Most looked respectful now. A few still seemed uncertain about what they had witnessed. But the open mockery and dismissal that had colored David's first 3 years at the academy was gone. Bryn appeared at their table carrying his breakfast tray. "May I sit?" David gestured to an empty chair. The Corvasi sat down heavily, and David noticed the change in him. The arrogance had been stripped away, replaced by something quieter, more thoughtful. "I've been thinking all night," Bryn said without preamble. "About what happened. About what you said and did. About what it means. And," David prompted, "my people built our entire military philosophy around our natural advantages. Strong armor, high durability. We charge into battle because we can survive it. But that's not courage. That's just using what we were born with." Bryn looked at David directly. "You showed me that real courage is acting when you have everything to lose. When survival isn't guaranteed by biology. That's what I didn't understand about humans." Stellan joined them next, uninvited but not unwelcome. The Hyperion sat down and pushed his breakfast around his plate without eating. "I couldn't sleep. My danger sense kept replaying the moment I withdrew. Kept showing me that if I had stayed, I would have died." "You made the smart choice," David said. "Did I?" Stellan asked. "Or did I just prove that having an advantage makes you weak? I withdrew because I knew. You stayed because you didn't know." Which of us was actually brave? Mira arrived last, completing the group. She sat down and looked at each of them in turn. The Academy administration held an emergency meeting last night. They're reviewing the cylinder tradition. Might ban it entirely. "Because of what happened?" Rachel asked. "Because of what almost happened," Mira corrected. They realize that allowing the game to continue with species that lack natural protections is essentially sanctioning suicide. The tradition only worked because participants could manage the risk through their biology. You removed that safety net, David. You played the game as it was actually meant to be played, and it scared them. David thought about that. The cylinder had become a ritual, carefully managed through biological advantages. But it had started as something raw. A true test of courage against death. Humans had stripped away the pretense and exposed the reality underneath. "Maybe it should be banned," David said. "If I'd lost yesterday, I'd be dead. That's not something that should be encouraged for pride or tradition." "But you didn't lose," Bryn said. "You won. You proved something important. If they ban it now, it looks like they're protecting other species from the standard human set." Professor Harnack approached their table. The Krill looked tired, like he had spent the night in meetings. "David Reed, the headmaster wishes to speak with you immediately." David exchanged glances with his friends, then stood. "Am I in trouble?" "That remains to be determined," Harnack said neutrally. "Follow me." They walked through the academy corridors in silence. Students stepped aside to let them pass, watching David with open curiosity. He felt like a specimen under examination, which perhaps he was. The human who had done something no one expected. The headmaster's office occupied a prominent position overlooking one of the station's observation decks. Through the large windows, stars wheeled past in their eternal dance. The headmaster himself was a Viridian, a species known for diplomacy and long-term thinking. His kind often lived for centuries and viewed events through a lens of historical perspective. "Sit," the headmaster said without preamble. David sat. "You created a significant problem yesterday," the headmaster began. "The cylinder tradition has existed at this academy for 400 years. In that time, there have been 0 fatalities, 0 permanent injuries. The game was considered safe because participants had the biological capacity to manage risk." "But it was never really safe," David interrupted. "It was just carefully managed through advantages." "Precisely." The headmaster's eyes, which had seen centuries of students come and go, focused on David with uncomfortable intensity. "You expose that truth. You participated without advantages and survived through chance and will. In doing so, you've made it impossible for us to continue the tradition as it was. I'm sorry? David wasn't sure what response was expected. Don't be. You did what needed doing. The headmaster turned to look out at the stars. The Coalition has been integrating humanity for 30 years. In that time, we've learned much about your species, your tactical creativity, your technological innovation, your capacity for cooperation. But yesterday you taught us something we hadn't fully grasped. What's that? That human courage is fundamentally different from courage in species with natural defenses. When a Corvasi faces danger, their armor gives them confidence. When a Hyperion enters risk, their danger sense guides them. When a Ventari suffers injury, regeneration awaits. But humans have none of these advantages. Every risk you take is genuine, every danger is real, and you face it anyway. The headmaster turned back to face David. That makes human military service more valuable than we realized. It also makes human students more important to this academy's mission. You don't just bring tactical perspective. You bring an understanding of courage that most species have forgotten or never knew. David didn't know what to say to that. I'm not punishing you, the headmaster continued. I'm promoting you. Effective immediately, you're assigned to the Advanced Tactical Program. You'll work directly with senior instructors on developing new doctrines for integrated coalition forces. Your perspective is needed. Sir, I'm only a third-year student. You're a third-year student who faced death 6 times yesterday and smiled while doing it. That earns you a seat at tables usually reserved for officers and veterans. The headmaster's expression softened slightly. The Coalition needs to understand humanity better, needs to integrate human military philosophy into our broader strategic thinking. You can help with that. David left the headmaster's office in a daze. Advanced Tactical Program, direct work with senior instructors. It was more opportunity than he had ever imagined, and it had come from the most frightening experience of his life. Rachel and Omar found him in the observation deck an hour later. He had been staring at Earth, a blue dot barely visible in the distance, thinking about home and what had happened. You're famous, Rachel announced. Earth's president released a statement praising your courage. The Coalition Council issued a formal recognition, and apparently, enrollment applications from human students have tripled in the last 12 hours. Everyone wants to be the next human who smiles at death, Omar added. It's already becoming a cultural meme. The human smile, symbol of facing impossible odds with calm acceptance. David groaned. I didn't do it to start a trend. I did it because it was necessary. Doesn't matter, Rachel said. You've changed how everyone sees humans. Changed how humans see themselves too. We're not just the newcomers anymore. We're the species that invented Russian roulette and actually plays it. Over the next few weeks, David watched as his actions rippled outward. The cylinder tradition was formally suspended pending review. Bryn used his family's influence to create a scholarship program for human students. Stellan began research into how different species experienced and understood courage. Mira joined David in the Advanced Tactical Program, saying she wanted to learn from the human perspective. But the biggest change was in how other students treated humans. The casual dismissal was gone. In its place was respect, sometimes even awe. Human students reported that their contributions in class were taken more seriously. Their tactical suggestions were considered, rather than dismissed. Their presence was welcomed rather than merely tolerated. David gave a lecture 3 weeks after the challenge, required attendance for all students, faculty encouraged to participate. The tactical amphitheater was packed. He stood at the podium and looked out at hundreds of faces from dozens of species. You all know what happened in the proving grounds. What you might not know is why I did it, so I'm going to explain. Humans evolved on a world that was trying to kill us. We had no natural weapons, no armor, no special abilities. We were prey animals that somehow became apex predators through intelligence and cooperation. Every step of human history is the story of facing things that should have killed us and surviving anyway. When we invented Russian roulette, it wasn't because we were insane. It was because sometimes we needed to remind ourselves of our own mortality, needed to face death directly and make a choice about it. The game is horrible and shouldn't exist, but it exists because humans have always needed ways to test ourselves against our greatest fear. What I did in the proving grounds wasn't special. Every human who ever did anything important did the same thing. Faced death without knowing if they would survive. Pulled the trigger, metaphorically or literally, and hoped for an empty chamber. That's the human condition. That's what we bring to the coalition. You have armor and regeneration and danger sense. Those are wonderful gifts. But they also mean you've never had to develop the kind of courage that comes from being fragile, from knowing that one mistake, one bad choice, one unlucky moment can end you permanently. Humans live with that knowledge every moment of every day, and we choose to explore, to fight, to build, to create anyway, not despite our fear, but because we've learned to function with fear as a constant companion. That's what I want you to understand. Human courage isn't better than your courage. It's just different, born from different circumstances. And in an integrated coalition military, we need all kinds of courage, all perspectives, all ways of facing danger. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to demonstrate that, even if it was the most terrifying experience of my life. He smiled at that last part, and the room erupted in laughter and applause. The human smile, they would call it later, the expression of someone facing death and choosing to acknowledge it with humor, rather than fear. After the lecture, David found Bryn waiting outside. That was well said. You should consider military command after graduation. The coalition needs leaders who understand courage from all angles. Maybe, David said. Right now I'm just trying to survive advanced tactical studies. You survived the cylinder, Bryn pointed out. Everything else will be easy by comparison. They walked through the academy corridors together, and David realized something had fundamentally shifted. Not just in how others saw humans, but in how humans saw themselves. They weren't just compensating for lack of natural advantages. They were bringing something unique and valuable to the galactic community. The willingness to face any challenge, accept any risk, and smile while doing it. That was humanity's gift, and now everyone understood its value. David looked at Earth through a distant viewport and felt pride. Not just in himself, but in every human who had ever faced impossible odds. Every soldier, explorer, scientist, and dreamer who had looked at certain death and chosen to act anyway. They had shown the galaxy what courage without advantage looked like. And the galaxy was better for learning that lesson. 5 years later, David stood in a very different kind of room. Not the proving grounds with its ancient walls and ceremonial weight, but a modern strategic planning center aboard the Coalition flagship Unity. Holographic displays showed fleet positions across 3 sectors. Military officers from 24 species worked at stations, coordinating the largest combined operation in Coalition history. David wore the uniform of a Coalition tactical officer now, with insignia marking him as a strategic advisor. The rank was unusual for someone his age, but his path to this position had been unusual from the start. Commander Reed. Admiral Tasvik, a Krill who had commanded fleets for 40 years, gestured him over. We need your assessment on the assault plan. David studied the holographic battlefield. The Coalition faced a hostile force that had refused diplomatic solutions and threatened border worlds. Military action had become necessary, but the enemy held strong defensive positions. Any assault would be costly. The Corvasi admirals want a direct assault, Tasvik said. Overwhelming force. Trust their ship's armor to weather the defensive fire and break through. That's their doctrine, David said, recognizing the familiar pattern. It plays to their strengths, and it will result in 30 to 40% casualties. Acceptable losses by traditional military calculus, but still thousands of lives. The admiral looked at David. The human diplomatic mission requested you specifically for this planning session. They said you understand courage differently than most. David smiled slightly. 5 years since the cylinder, and that event still defined how people saw him. The human who smiled at death. The ambassador of courage. The tactical advisor who brought a unique perspective. Show me their defensive positions, David said. The holographic display zoomed in. The enemy had constructed a network of overlapping fire zones. Any direct approach would expose Coalition ships to devastating crossfire. The Corvasi solution was to accept those losses and push through anyway. Their ships could take it. Their crews could survive it, probably. What about a feint? David suggested. Make them think we're doing exactly what they expect. Mass for a frontal assault. Let them commit to defending against that approach. Then hit them from an unexpected angle. That's cowardice by traditional standards, another officer said. A Corvasi, naturally. We have the strength to win directly. Why use tricks? Because tricks save lives, David said patiently. He had this conversation often. Humans aren't strong enough to win direct confrontations. We had to develop tactics that let us punch above our weight. That's not cowardice, that's intelligence. Admiral Tasvik studied the display. Show me how it would work. David sketched out the plan. A visible buildup in one sector, drawing enemy attention and resources. Meanwhile, a smaller force would loop through less defended space and strike at the enemy's supply lines. Force them to divide their defenses or abandon their strong positions. Casualties with this approach? The Admiral asked. 5 to 10%. Maybe less if executed properly. And time frame? 3 weeks instead of 3 days. We're trading speed for safety. The Korvasi officer shook his head. Warriors accept casualties. That's the nature of war. Trying to avoid all risk is impossible. I'm not trying to avoid all risk, David said. I'm trying to avoid unnecessary risk. There's a difference between courage and waste. Tasvik made a decision. We use Commander Reed's plan. Prepare the feint operation. Disseminate new orders to fleet commanders. The Korvasi officer looked like he wanted to argue but held his tongue. Command decisions were final, even if they went against cultural preference. Later, David found himself in the officer's mess, looking out at the stars. A familiar voice spoke behind him. Still thinking about that day? David turned to see Bryn, now wearing coalition military insignia as well. The Korvasi had graduated from the academy and entered military service, driven by what he had learned about courage and leadership. They had stayed in touch over the years, had even served together on several missions. Which day? David asked. You know which one. The day you smiled while holding a gun to your head. The day that changed everything. David sat down and Bryn joined him. I think about it sometimes. About how close I came to dying. About how the odds were genuinely 50-50 on that last turn. Do you regret it? No, but I understand it better now. I wasn't trying to die. I was trying to prove that humans could stand equal to any species. That our lack of advantages didn't make us lesser. You proved more than that, Bryn said. You changed how the entire coalition thinks about courage and risk. Changed military doctrine. Changed how we train officers. All because you were willing to pull a trigger when everyone expected you to quit. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. David thought about the path that had led from that day to this one. The Advanced Tactical Program. The Military Commission. The dozens of missions where human perspective had made a difference. The lives saved because someone suggested a clever solution instead of a strong one. I spoke with Stellan last week, Bryn said. He's teaching now. Academy instructor in strategic studies. He tells his students about the cylinder, about how his danger sense made him withdraw while you stayed. Uses it as an example of how biological advantages can become psychological weaknesses. That's interesting, David said. Is he right? I think so. My people's armor made us lazy. We developed tactics that assumed we could survive mistakes. You humans developed tactics that assumed you couldn't. In the long run, your approach creates better soldiers. David's comm device chimed. Admiral Tasvik requesting his presence in the strategic center. The operation was beginning. Time to see if my plan works, David said, standing. It will work, Bryn said confidently, because you designed it the way humans design everything, assuming failure is possible and planning around it. The operation took 23 days. The feint drew enemy forces exactly where David predicted. The flanking force cut supply lines without major engagement. The enemy abandoned their defensive positions and sued for peace. Coalition casualties 4%, less than David's estimate. Admiral Tasvik called him to the bridge personally. Commander Reed, your tactical plan succeeded beyond projections. You saved thousands of coalition lives today. I just applied human military philosophy, sir. Avoid risk where possible. Use intelligence instead of strength. Win without fighting if you can. That philosophy is becoming standard coalition doctrine now. Your species has taught us valuable lessons. The Admiral paused. I'm recommending you for advancement to strategic command. The coalition needs officers who understand that courage isn't just about facing danger. It's about smart application of force. David thought about that. Strategic command meant leading major operations, making decisions that affected thousands of lives. It was far from where he started, a third-year student trying to prove humans belonged at a military academy. I accept, sir. Thank you. Weeks later, David returned to the Advanced Tactical Institute for a ceremony. The Academy had decided to preserve the revolver from the cylinder as a historical artifact. It would be displayed in the military history collection with a plaque explaining its significance. The The ceremony was simple. Current students attended, learning about an event that had occurred before most of them enrolled. David stood before the display case and looked at the weapon that had nearly killed him. "Commander Reed," the current headmaster said, "would you like to say a few words?" David nodded and stepped to the podium. He looked at the young faces before him, seeing dozens of species represented. The academy had grown more diverse since his time here. Human enrollment had increased significantly. This weapon represents a moment when I had to choose between pride and wisdom, between proving a point and preserving my life. I chose pride, and I was lucky enough that choice didn't kill me. But luck isn't strategy. Luck isn't something you can rely on. If I were facing that situation today with the experience I have now, I would make a different choice. I would withdraw after the first round, not because I'm less courageous now, but because I understand that courage without wisdom is just waste. The most important thing I learned from the cylinder isn't that humans can face death bravely. It's that knowing when not to face death is often more important. Military leadership isn't about being fearless. It's about managing fear, managing risk, and making decisions that accomplish objectives while preserving lives. I'm honored that this weapon is being preserved, but I hope the lesson people take from it isn't that pulling the trigger was brave. The lesson should be that understanding why I pulled the trigger and understanding why I shouldn't have are both important. He stepped back, and the students applauded. Rachel and Omar were there too, having traveled from their positions elsewhere in the coalition to attend. They had remained friends through the years, bound together by shared experience. After the ceremony, David found himself back in the Proving Grounds chamber. It looked the same as it had 5 years ago. The walls still held centuries of names. The circular floor still bore the marks of countless challenges. But the cylinder was no longer played here. The tradition had been permanently suspended after David's demonstration. The academy had decided that testing courage didn't require risking death. There were other ways to measure a warrior's heart. Bryn joined him in the empty chamber. "Feeling nostalgic?" "Feeling grateful," David corrected. "I could have died here. Should have, probably, given the odds. But I survived, and surviving gave me the chance to do things that matter. To save lives through tactical planning. To prove that human military philosophy has value. To show that courage without advantage is still courage. The galaxy understands that now. Humans are respected, valued. Your species' contributions to coalition military effectiveness are documented and celebrated. You did that, you and every other human who refused to accept lesser status." David turned to leave the chamber. As he walked toward the exit, he paused at the archway with its ancient inscriptions. He found the one Rachel had translated years ago. "Remember mortality." Good advice, he thought. Humans remembered mortality every day. It shaped their decisions, their tactics, their entire approach to existence, and maybe that was humanity's greatest contribution to the galaxy. The reminder that life was fragile, valuable, and worth protecting. Years after that, David commanded his own fleet. He led coalition forces in defensive operations and peacekeeping missions. His tactical approach became textbook material, studied by officers from every species. The human method of warfare, built on intelligence rather than strength, became standard doctrine. But he never forgot the day he held a revolver to his temple and smiled. Never forgot the feeling of metal against skin, the mechanical click of an empty chamber, the weight of knowing that chance rather than skill would determine his survival. That memory kept him honest, kept him from becoming arrogant or careless, reminded him that every decision he made affected real lives, that casualties weren't acceptable just because they were statistically expected, that courage was valuable but wisdom was essential. On Earth, the story of the cylinder became legendary. Children learned about the human who faced death to prove humanity's worth. Military academies taught it as an example of courage under pressure. Historians debated whether David's choice was brave or foolish, necessary or reckless. But David knew the truth. It had been all of those things. Brave and foolish, necessary and reckless. A moment when pride and principle had overridden caution and wisdom. He had survived through luck as much as courage. And surviving had given him the opportunity to show that humans brought more to the galaxy than just courage. They brought tactics and strategy. They brought the perspective of a species that understood vulnerability and had spent millennia learning to overcome it. They brought the wisdom that came from facing mortality every day. 50 years after the cylinder, an elderly David attended a ceremony at the academy. They were finally retiring the revolver from display, moving it to archives. New generations of students had their own challenges, their own ways of proving themselves. The ancient tradition had become history. David stood before the weapon one last time. Looking at it now, he saw not a tool of death but a symbol of a pivotal moment. The moment when humans stopped being dismissed as weak and started being recognized as valuable. When courage without advantage was acknowledged as courage nonetheless. A young cadet approached him, human, barely 20 years old. "Commander Reed, I wanted to thank you. I'm here because of what you did. Because you proved humans belong at this academy." David smiled, not the smile from that day. Facing death with calm acceptance, a different smile. Warmer. Wiser. The smile of someone who had lived long enough to see the impact of a single choice ripple outward for decades. "You belong here because you earned it," David said. "What I did was just show people what humans have always been. Brave not because we lack fear, but because we act despite it. That's always been true. I just made it visible." The cadet nodded and walked away. David took one last look at the revolver, at the weapon that had nearly ended his life and instead had defined it. Then he turned and left the chamber. Behind him, the proving ground stood empty and quiet, a memorial to ancient traditions and modern understanding. The names on the walls remained, generations of warriors who had tested themselves in various ways. David's name was there too, carved into stone 5 decades ago. A reminder of the day a human loaded a revolver, faced death repeatedly, and smiled because he understood something fundamental about his species. Humans survived not despite their fragility, but because of their awareness of it. They faced the universe knowing they could die easily, and they built civilizations anyway, explored unknown space anyway, fought for what mattered anyway. That was humanity's gift to the galaxy. The reminder that courage and fear were not opposites but partners. That acknowledging vulnerability didn't create weakness but enabled strength. That the willingness to face death, when combined with the wisdom to avoid unnecessary death, created the best kind of warrior. David left the academy that day and never returned. But his legacy remained. In the tactics taught to new officers, in the respect shown to human soldiers, in the understanding that every species brought unique value to the coalition, and in one old revolver locked away in archives that had once held a chamber with his name on it. The chamber had been empty when he pulled the trigger, but the impact of that moment had been anything but empty. It had filled the galaxy with new understanding, new respect, and new appreciation for what humans brought to the stars. The class had chosen a deadly game. The human had loaded the revolver and smiled. And in that smile was everything that made humanity unique, valuable, and worth celebrating. Courage without advantage. Wisdom born from vulnerability. Strength built on the acceptance of weakness. That was humanity. That was David Reed. That was the lesson the cylinder had taught and the lesson the galaxy would never forget.